Chapter 13 of A Diamond Sky Above Titanic, a Good Omens fanfiction, written by SeaBlueEyes, read aloud by SkyAsimaru. If you enjoy this podfic, you can check out the original story on Archive of Our Own. If you would like to hear more of my recordings or see some of my own work, you can find me through the pen and screen name of SkyAsimaru. A Diamond Sky Above Titanic, Chapter 13, Unwilling to Leave. Warning: for graphic depictions of violence and non-consensual rape. Please skip to the next chapter if you do not want to listen. Time, apparently, was done playing its games. There was no dramatic slow-motion effect now, no compelling blurring of the backdrop, no stylistic muting of the world beyond their breathing. There was just Asmodius and his wings, and his sword, and his wrath, coming straight for them. Oh, and Death. Death was watching closely, circling, eagerly waiting. Death was excited. Had Crowley been human, he would have passed out. Instead, "Move!" he screamed. He threw himself and Aziraphel to the floor, as with one downbeat of those terrifying wings, Asmodius, hands outstretched like the talons of some infernal bird of prey, sword blazing with the flames of hell, burst towards them. At that same moment, without having to think, it was pure instinct, their wings exploded from their backs the way petals burst forth in accelerated time-lapse photography. Long, glossy feathers as sheer white as snow, the angels and the demons identical to each other. Whiteness momentarily filled their vision, closing around them in a delicate, heavenly pearl. Then the pearl was shattered as they slammed shoulders and collarbones and temples hard against the veined marble floor, and all the air was knocked from their bodies. Asmodius's terrible sword sank deep into the stone, only inches from where they had stood but moments ago. His great wings shot out straight, like sails snapped taut by the wind, breaking right through the wood paneling on either side of the entrance, and sending jagged splinters blasting through the air. The stench of sulfur hit his prey with the force of a tidal wave, overpowering, suffocating, a weapon in its own right. Crowley, spluttering, half-retching, contracted his wings to force his battered body to its feet and dragged the dazed and bleeding. Oh God, fuck, he was bleeding. Aziraphel up. Clasping hands, they ran as the fiend, mad, monstrous, senseless, fought to free his stuck sword. "Come on!" Crowley shouted, pulling his angel by the hand. Their wings curled around their backs in instinctive protection as they fled, pushed them forwards as they spun around the staircase to flee down the next flight. Behind them, Asmodius was free and spitting at them in hellspeak, an incessant attack of vowelless noise that sucked in the air to morph its screeching into words, and had all humans crying in agony as their ears bled. "Come on!" Crowley screamed again. They twisted and ran down yet another embellished staircase, and the one below that, spinning down them so fast it was dizzying, dodging white-faced humans in their path, grasping banisters as they swung around, whilst from above, all the while, came that sword, and those eyes, and those wings, only a staircase behind, slicing through the metal of the railings like it was paper. Their feet met water, as sharp and cold as ice, lit turquoise by the lights above it, at the foot of the last staircase. Ahead were the ornate doors that led to the first-class dining room, already partly submerged. They didn't hesitate. Between hell or high water, it turns out there is no choice. "Hey, come on, Aziraphel! Come on!" It parted before them, flew up as trembling walls of aquamarine to either side. Still ankle-deep, the two splashed straight through it, and if they had dared to look back, they would have seen the great wings that accompanied the harsh scrape of burnt feathers against wood, the face that writhed with hatred and hissed those incoherent cries of fury, the rise of steam as the water hissed and vaporized on contact with infernal skin, and something else entirely that was not meant for Earth's atmosphere. Crowley and Aziraphel, their hands held so tight, gasping now with exertion and terror, dragged themselves through the doors and out of the water, and ran up the incline of the ship. Too late, too late! Asmodius had pushed his gigantic wings through the doors, and now, unimpeded by space, stretched them wide. One great, white-hot wing knocked the two of them off their feet as he lunged at them from across the room. With cries of pain, they were sent flying through the air, Crowley crashing in a heap on the floor, Aziraphel scattering candles and crockery and elegantly arranged lily centerpieces as he was hurled across a table. Deep crimson seeped through his golden curls, and blood pooled into the smashed plate beneath his head. Crowley, dazed, light-headed from a collision with a table leg, pushed himself to his knees in time to see the fiend land on his angel, straddle him, bring that terrible flickering sword up high, see Aziraphel weakly raise his head, his eyes flicker behind their cracked glasses, wet redness run from his mouth. "No!" With wingtips and fingertips and feet, Crowley leapt at the other demon and struck hard against him from the side with all the force he possessed. The two spun through the air and crashed to the floor in a tangle of feathers and torn elegant suits and crockery fragments. There was the crash of broken dishes, the splintering of wood as wings cracked down against tables, the vrooosh-vrooosh-vrooosh as the flaming sword was sent cartwheeling through the air to land sizzling in the spreading water. For a moment, the archdemon lying across from him, blood running down his face and glass from smashed champagne flutes matted in his hair, Crowley felt a rush to his head like triumph. Then wings pinned him to the floor, and long-nailed hands lifted him from under his armpits, raising him up until he was level with the great demon's face, somehow taller than he had seemed before. Crowley opened his mouth, but no sound would come out. Archdemon Asmodius's eyes were the most terrifying thing Crowley had ever seen on Earth. The rest of his face was normal, still smooth, still tanned, still superficially lovely. But where lascivious, burgundy eyes had once been, now there was only red, There were no whites, no distinction between irises or pupils, just bright, sickening, blood red, filling the eye sockets entirely. They were wide and unblinking, and as Asmodius smiled at him, a hideous smile in a mouth larger than any human's, that showed every one of his now 1,000 needle-thin, whiter than white teeth. The eyes smiled too, a smile so dark, so malevolent, so totally, completely, inherently evil, that Crowley felt his racing heart stop absolutely dead mid-beat. And then Asmodius laughed. He laughed, and he laughed, and somehow that pretty, playful sound was even more terrifying than the full force of his crazed wrath moments ago. He opened his jaws, revealed a mouth as white as it was red from row after row of those same needle-like fangs. "Crowley," said the fiend, still smiling that awful, false smile, like a grimace of loathing. His whole face was writhing with hatred, but he was still smiling. "Crowley." His monochromatic eyes focused directly onto that little creature held in his grasp, 7 feet above the floor. Somehow pupils were not needed to know that he was making eye contact. It was a physical force, his gaze, like stepping in front of an inferno. The archdemon of lust and wrath smiled at his prey. "Did you think I'd forgotten you, Crowley? Did you think I was going to leave you out?" Crowley found he couldn't speak. He only stared, unable to look away, into those horrible, nightmarish eyes that he knew would haunt him forever. Asmodius smirked and indicated the fallen angel with a flick of his chin. "Is he a good lover, Crowley?" Crowley stared. "No, of course he isn't." Asmodius answered his own question to himself, as though an afterthought. "He's a virgin angel." Crowley was writhing now, wanting to speak, wanting to look away. He could feel blood trickling down across his stomach and somehow continuing past his waistband to his crotch. "I bet you're a good lover, though, aren't you?" Asmodius allowed real malevolence to creep into his smile now. "Oh, yes, I bet you're fantastic." Crowley froze. Asmodius's eyes widened the same way in which eyes that possess pupils will dilate when sexually aroused. Behind him, china tinkled as the rising water carried floating crockery across the surface. But it was quieter than before, somehow, as though Titanic herself was ceasing her sinking just to watch the 2 demons in horror. Asmodius leaned in ever so slightly closer. "Let's find out, shall we?" And he dug his nails deep through Crowley's clothes, through his skin, through his blood vessels, sent his venom straight into the bloodstream. He unleashed his ultimate weapon. It took half a second. Then Crowley cried out as he came. One touch, and he was right there at the climax of all climaxes. His blood pumping so hard, his entire body went rigid. Not with pleasure, but with complete agony. It was a climax of torture like nothing he had experienced before. It was in every cell of his body, searing him to the bone, burning his soul with that lacerating, lascivious passion. So deep, no fiber was left untainted. He felt his teeth sink into his lower lip as he tried in vain to hold back the scream rising in his throat, while the orgasm lasted and lasted and lasted. He was being brought to the brink in the throes of excruciation, and being held there, convulsing and shuddering and thrashing, over and over and over, unable to escape, locked in his own body, in his agony. Blood filled his mouth. His teeth were sunk deep in his lips without his realizing, coating his gritted teeth, running down his chin from his torn lips. And then, whilst raping his body, suddenly Asmodius changed the game, began raping his mind. Crowley could feel him inside his head, white-hot metaphysical fingers peeling back barriers within him, ransacking his outermost memories, those least precious and least protected, ravaging like a hurricane, devastating and desecrating, and debauching everything he touched as he delved deeper and deeper within. Images flashed before his eyes as the fiend worked, dragged there mutilated and disordered, senseless, worthless, and panic was rising within him now like a flood, pooling inside him, drowning him, filling every cavity of his corporeal body with all his terror and all his shame. Panic so strong he felt his stomach muscles contract with sharp nausea, because he knew what Asmodius was searching for, and Crowley could not give him to Asmodius. Desperation mounted. His torturer continued to unravel, continued to iron, continued to violate, getting closer and closer. His every blow was perfectly executed to exact the most destruction. He had been practicing this. This was where his greatest talent lay. Crowley, limbs flailing uselessly, mind scrambling uselessly, through all the coherency and all the strength he had left, not into blocking out the physical pain, pain he could withstand, pain that was his alone to bear, but into protecting Aziraphel. His memories of Aziraphel were theirs. They were sacred. He could not let Asmodius in. He had to stop him. But now his torturer was too close, and all his greatest wrong-doings, right-doings, his most undemonly actions, his moments of deepest shame, his very worst memories, all were being dragged, screaming and flailing before his eyes. There, distress at the crucifixion of Christ. There, regret at the burning of the Library of Alexandria. There, helplessness as, too drunk to sober up and save himself, he was discorporated by a 9th century mugger. There, guilt at slitting a certain angel's throat during a heated pre-arrangement argument. No! Crowley forced himself to push harder than ever before to maintain his final line of defenses, even as the archdemon, bored with this history, reached memories as recent as that night, and Crowley saw the iceberg before him again, felt his own anguish, felt the terrible conflicting emotions, the traitorous love for the ship, the traitorous fear of returning to hell, Completely naked, all was laid bare for Asmodius's raging scarlet eyes. All the things he was not allowed to see. And all the while Crowley could feel his defenses flickering, cracking, buckling, straining against those fingers that ripped and tore. Then Aziraphel's face completely filled his vision, filled his whole world, even above the pain. And Crowley knew he had failed. Asmodius saw everything. The enchanted night they had played together. The hazy gray dawn they had first kissed. The first time they had made love, pushing his lover back into silk sheets and warmth and the onset of ecstasy. The first time he had held the sleeping angel in his arms and touched his lips to each eyelid. He was seeing everything, memories so dear and personal and for no one else's eyes, and he was mocking them. Laughter, each syllable hitting him as a metaphysical punch. And it was hysterical, it was insane, and it was endless. Crowley's teeth were pulled out of the ruin of his tongue as he screamed and screamed and screamed. And now, as though it could have become even worse, Asmodeus was watching the angel and the demon together at their own climax. The deepest one, the first one, the last one, all of them. And here he held the vision, brought it as close to lucidity as he could, so that Crowley saw Aziraphel in the past, in his happiest memory, in his safest place, in his most comfortable dream, but felt only the pain of the present, the absolute torture of the orgasm induced by Asmodeus. Asmodius's lips peeled back in the facsimile of a smile. You like that, Crowley? The fiend spoke through his touch, gloating, enjoying every moment, words burning and spitting as white-hot brandings. Yes, it feels so good, doesn't it? Crowley cried out in utter agony, both in mind and body. Get out of me! Oh, but you don't mean that, Crowley. Crowley's eyes rolled into the back of his head. He was so weak, his poor, desecrated body was only flailing now, feet twitching as though in spasm beneath the noose. Asmodius's laughter was filling his mind. All he could hear and all he could feel was grating, precise pain in every cell of his broken body, the touch of an alien mind tearing through his own. Crowley didn't see Aziraphel drag himself upright out of the pool of his own blood. He didn't see the angel's eyes blaze with golden, holy light as his whole body trembled in rage. He didn't see his hands, incandescent, as his palms filled with the brilliant, glowing white of the wrath of God, of all the celestial powers of the heavens. Neither, apparently, did Asmodius, until it was too late. Aziraphale pulled back his glorious wings and burst across the room with all heaven's fury behind him. Asmodius didn't have time to turn, let alone to run, to escape this avenging principality of God. The angel's righteous fist smashed into the archdemon's jaw, crushing him against a pillar and splintering it straight down the middle. Aziraphale just had time to see Crowley, knocked out of the fiend's grip, collapse in a crumpled, broken heap to the floor and lie still. Then the angel's right fist, still blazing with that golden fire that licked and darted, grabbed the fiend scrambling at his feet, desperately clasping the two halves of his hideous, broken face together by the lapels and drew him up. He was angrier than he could ever remember, so filled with rage that the golden flames filled his vision. And Asmodius, seeing that terrible, beauteous, virtuous fire where eyes had been, cried out in horror and writhed uselessly against the hand that gripped him. Aziraphale raised his fist once more. He was incoherent with fury, frenzied, seething amidst holy flames that grew ever stronger and hotter. Words flew from his lips, forced out through his clenched teeth. Not in English, but in Nokian, the tongue of angels, a language of vowels and sows and sighs that seemed to command the very particles of the air to sound with the echoes of each unearthly, inhuman syllable. "Leave!" Fist crunched into cheekbone. "Crowley!" Wet thud in raw muscle. "Alone!" And then, with the force of 1,000 men and 100 angels, Aziraphale threw all of the celestial power he possessed, all of his ire, all of his righteousness and virtuousness and goodness and purity, all of his love and devotion for Crowley, his every fiber and every atom. He poured it, all of it, into his smiting fist, and under the blow of that awesome might, the hand of God himself, the very will of heaven, the infernal creature's ear-piercing scream was torn midway from his throat as he was smashed deep into the ground, smashed so hard the floorboards beneath collapsed, and his body was pulled into the hole as the carpet sank around him. Instantly, the room fell silent. The angel's fire was snuffed out like a candle. Aziraphale could feel himself cooling from that white heat. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the erstwhile archdemon, the body submerged in the too small and too shallow grave. Asmodius's arms and legs protruded from the hole at sickeningly unnatural angles, with his gigantic wings twisted backwards in a direction that was painful to even look at. His neck was totally broken. His head had flopped onto his chest, hiding the monstrous, misshapen face. Asmodius was gone for good. The demon's angelic conqueror let out a breath, long and quivering. Whatever had been possessing him before, adrenaline, grace, God, he now felt it leave his body. His knees gave way beneath him, and he sank slowly to the floor, gripping a chair leg for support as his vision wavered and little shimmering speckles twirled before his eyes. His wings flailed weakly in a futile attempt to regain some balance, and he struck out his other arm to steady himself. It was then, in that action, that he became aware of the pain in the hand of that arm. He was only a principality. Asmodeous had been an archdemon of hell, which explained why Aziraphale's right hand was now completely destroyed. The whole thing was blackened and crumpled, a charred and petrified fist. His wrist was red and shiny, the blistered skin beneath his shirt sticking agonizingly against the inside of the fabric. Nausea rose in his throat, but all that came out was a moan. He felt faint. On the ground in front of him, Crowley was stirring. Aziraphale looked up from the wreck of his hand, in time to see his beloved slowly push himself up with both hands, carefully, delicately, but as far as he could tell, not painfully. His eyes were muzzy and unfocused at first, but they eventually registered the ruined body of the archdemon. He looked from the hole in the floor, then across to his angel. Neither spoke. What they wanted to say couldn't be expressed in words, even in the tongues of angels. So instead, they reached out, Aziraphale too drained to do more than raise his arms. So Crowley shifted across to him, and just clung to each other. There was blood clotted in Aziraphale's hair, and drying down his face from a thick nosebleed. Crowley's chin and lacerated lips shone scarlet. They were still alive. Heaven and hell had not taken them yet. They were still together. Water slithered across the floor and seeped up their clothes. Further down the room, there was melodious chinking as plates and cups were lifted and carried by the rising flood. Chairs and tables began to float. The flaming sword, somewhere underwater, lay lost forever. And Crowley and Aziraphale, one demon and one angel, sat in the middle of the dying Titanic, held each other as though their very lives depended upon it, and encased themselves within their wings like they might just shut out the whole world. To be continued in Chapter 14. Thank you for reading. Please drop by the archive and let the author know what you thought of their work.